Most people agree that Jesus really was a historical figure who lived and died. But the question is, did he rise from the dead? Is he God? Is there any way to prove such a thing, or is it just a matter of faith? Taking a few steps away from the classical arguments for God or for Jesus' divinity, we'll be looking at another historical puzzle, the Shroud of Turin. Is it for real? Could it really point to Jesus and the resurrection? Or is it just a neat legend and nothing more? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. We're so excited to have you joining with us today. Theology on Air is an outgrowth of Theology on Tap, which is the ministry in Houston to young adults where we gather around craft beer and interesting topics around theology, philosophy, faith, and culture. And then in the podcast, we get to dig deeper and have interesting guests like Dr. Habermas. So if you like what you hear, I would love if you guys wanted to go and subscribe, share it, tell all your friends. Maybe that could be your Christmas present this year as you tell everyone to go listen to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC here in Houston. I am joined, as always, by Evan McClanahan, the Senior Pastor at First Lutheran in Midtown Houston. And today we are so thrilled to be joined by our guest, Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Habermas has authored, co-authored, and edited some 45 books, half of which center on various aspects of Jesus' resurrection. These include Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? And The Risen Jesus and Future Hope. Other published topics concern near-death experiences, religious doubt, and personal suffering. He's been a visiting or adjunct professor at more than 16 different graduate schools and seminaries in the U.S. and abroad. And he's currently the Distinguished Research Professor at the Liberty University School of Divinity and Graduate School, mouthful, where he has taught since 1981 in their PhD program. So, Dr. Habermas, what a thrill to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be with you folks. I like your background. Those are nice colors.
Oh, thank you. We try to keep it fresh.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you have talked and written on so much in the apologetics world and theology, and I actually heard you speak on the Shroud of Turin a couple of years ago at a conference. But before we get to all of the apologetic nerdy stuff, I would love to just hear a little bit about you, your own story, how you came to faith, and what interested you in this world. Like what got you into writing and teaching about apologetic or evidences and that kind of thing?
What if I gave a one-word answer and I said, death?
I would be intrigued by that.
Yeah, I said that on purpose. I do so many interviews, hundreds, that I keep thinking, as I answer these kind of questions, I think, wow, I've never heard myself say that. I never looked at this from this perspective. And what I mean by death is this. It occurred to me a while back that my interest in apologetics is framed by the deaths of the two most important people in my life up to the last point, which was 1995. When I was a child, my great-grandmother died. Now, most of us don't think of our great-grandmothers as the most important person in our life, but my great-grandmother was the most important person in my life. My folks knew that. We had a very close family, but my folks knew the place that my great-grandmother occupied, and she died when I was 8 years old. And I think more than anything else, that sent me on a search for, as strange as it sounds, it was a few years later after she died that I started wondering about, is death the end? Is there anything beyond this? And so on. And then I worked through a long, long period of doubt, about 10 straight years of really soul-searching doubt, and then probably 10 more years of on and off doubt. And about 3 years after my doubt period, as far as I can tell, ended, my wife and mother of my 4 children died of stomach cancer.
Oh my gosh.
In 1995. So about 5 years before that, my doubt period was pretty much over. And by God's grace, I thought I would have it all my life. I thought it was a disease that some people get, and I just had it, and because of my inquiring, I don't take anything for granted, and I what if everything, and I asked for evidence, and I just thought I would keep up. And it stopped about 5 years before she died. And then I thought to myself, great, it's probably going to come back again. And it never did.
Hmm.
So I'm very thankful for that. But I'm sure that in a very important way, death framed my doubts, because it occurred to me a few years into my study of the resurrection that my real interest was that if Jesus was raised from the dead, I would have a basis for saying I was raised from the dead. And so I realized that this past historical event was somehow a groundwork for me to think about my own condition. So anyway, that little introduction, kind of shocking when people hear you say that, but I just realized myself that these two framing events were very, very important to me in kicking off my life. And it's strange we're having this interview because I'm from Detroit, and both my parents live with my sister and her family in Detroit, and both my parents are in hospice right now.
Hmm.
So a lot of things going on, and seems like we're always surrounded by this topic. But
Yep.
yeah, and as you mentioned, I've done a lot of stuff on near-death experiences and on death and dying. So I just think a
Yeah.
lot of my apologetics is caught up together. But I'll just make this last comment. I was satisfied a long time ago that Christianity has, frankly, more evidence than it needs.
Yeah.
I never would have said that 40 years ago. But there's more data for Christianity, and there's more coming all the time. If you know what stones to turn over and what books to pull off the shelf and where to look, there is plenty of evidence in probably no less than 5 to 10 different areas. And I don't mean here's 100 arguments for God's existence. I mean, God's existence would be one.
Yeah.
Resurrection would be one. Near-death experiences would be one. Intelligent design would be one. And of
Yeah.
course, we're discussing the shroud today. So that's one of them.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about death. I mean, you're right. It's everywhere. I don't know if you know Clay Jones. We had him on the podcast several months ago. He just wrote a book called Immortal, and he talks about how everybody is afraid of or thinks of death. Even if you say you don't, you do. And you have these immortality projects. And it was a fascinating interview because even if you haven't had to face it like you have, or like I have, it's out there. You know it's coming, and your mind is doing something with that, whether you like it or not. And so I think it's a valid answer.
No, to answer your question, I know Clay well. As a matter of fact, I don't even know if Clay called himself this, but I was a visiting professor at one of those 16 schools you mentioned. I was a visiting professor at Talbot for probably 15 years. And Clay was assigned to me back when I first started. And he took care of all my students, graded all their papers. That's usually what you do when you go to these graduate schools. You come and you lecture, and when you finish lecturing, you're done. And the person they assign to you finishes with the grades. And Clay was my guy, and over the years I've gotten to know him, and we've been at apologetics conferences together, and I've had dinner with he and his wife. And so, yeah, Clay's a good guy, and the stuff he does on pain and suffering is very noteworthy.
Yeah. We might have to have him back on to talk about that. But
Yeah.
so you mentioned that we have like more evidences than we even need for the existence of God, for the truth of the resurrection, that kind of thing. Before we get to the shroud, where we're going to spend most of our time, if you had to say what you think the best of those evidences is, now I know you've written so many books and the whole minimal facts thing, but like if you had to pick one sort of like go to, gosh, you just can't get away from the truth of all of this, what would you say is the best? It's kind of a trick question because they're all good.
Let me pick two in this way.
Okay.
Two, because there's two general areas in classic theology. Now, I'm not a Thomist. A bunch of my buddies are Thomists, meaning somebody who appreciates Thomas Aquinas and his philosophical writings. But Thomas was famous, and many others are too, for saying God wrote two books. There's the book of nature and the book of Revelation. And if I were divided into those categories, the book of nature can bring you to God, but I think is generally thought not to Christianity.
Right.
Whereas the book of Revelation talks about subjects, because Revelation includes miracles, a resurrection part, historical Jesus, reliability, New Testament. Whereas the other one, the book of nature, would include, I think, fascinating topics. It's just not my area, but fascinating topics like intelligent design, fine tuning, and near-death experiences. they're in the other category. I think in the natural category, near-death experiences are probably the strongest evidence. And I'm doing another thing right now. I just finished a big project on near-death experiences. I'm doing some people saw that, and so they asked me to do something similar for a scientific book on dualism, which includes a chapter on near-death experiences. And I told my editor that was assigned to me, his field is field is physics, and he works in the intelligent design field. And there's a lot of evidences for intelligent design, but I told him during our editing process that I think the evidence for near-death experience is even stronger. So he didn't say anything, maybe just being polite, but so I'd say near-death experience is there, and of course I would take resurrection on the revelatory side, because it's not just the resurrection; it's the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
If a homeless person had a near-death experience, let's say in the last few days, and let's say it lasted for a long time, and the press started saying this person was really dead in some way. They were really dead for that short period of time. Now they came back, but okay. We'd probably say that is really interesting. Take your place next to the hundreds of evidence NDEs. But we wouldn't say, you must be the Son of God. You must sit on God's right hand, and you must be promising eternity for all of us. That wouldn't be the response. So it's not just the resurrection. It's what the resurrection means and is offered, because there's no message like it anywhere in the world religions.
Yeah. We did a series a while back on evangelicalism, and people that have either walked away from faith or at least walked away from what we consider evangelicalism. That's another conversation for another day.
Sure.
But one of our guests, and we didn't talk about this during the podcast, but after we stopped recording, I asked the guest, he's an evangelical, I said, do you think that Jesus rose from the dead? And he said something like, I really hope so, because it's my only hope of being raised from the dead. It's just exactly what you were saying. It's so interesting. Yeah. It's working backwards. Like, I want that for me. And so I have to hope that that was true of the one who can make it true for me. I think.
No, I think that's true. I just wrote a long letter today to a guy who is what you call it what'd you call him?
Evangelical. It's kind of hard to say.
Well, this guy went to a very well-known church in the country. It's on the other side of the country, but we know it over here. So it's a well-known church, and he walked away, and he became an atheist, if I understand him correctly, and we've exchanged several long emails. But I do that with people all the time. I've had well over 1,000 conversations with doubters, because that's one of the areas I work in. I don't like it. I'm trying to help people. I'd rather move on, but they're hurting. So, yeah. And they will say that to me occasionally. One of them just said to me about 2 weeks ago, they'll say, yeah, I'm not a believer. I don't believe in the resurrection yet. I can't refute it. And something's really there. I just can't make up my mind as to what it is, what happened. So you don't deal easily with that kind of information.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to move us on to the real bread and butter of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin, which when I was little and I heard that, and I think my dad listened to some radio show about it, I sort of thought it was this like hokey thing, conspiracy theorist kind of deal within Christianity. But of course, the more I've learned and then listening to your talk, the more I thought, oh, wow, there's really something here. So for those listeners who maybe have never even heard of this, or they've just heard the term, but they don't know what it is, start off by just telling us, what is the Shroud of Turin? Give us a brief sort of history of what the heck this thing even is.
Yeah, let me make a provocative comment, first of all.
I hope you would.
Shroud of Turin is an incredible subject for this reason. If it's true, Christianity has a lot to gain, major league evidence. If it's not true, nothing in the book of Revelation or the book of nature says the Shroud of Turin has to be the real thing. Mm-hmm. If it's not, it's like, wow, that was a nice trip, wasn't it? But nothing hurts in Christianity. Right. Nothing is false. If the shroud turns out to be fake, and right now that's the main thing they're sure it's not. And we're talking about people who are not even believers who study the shroud. It's not a fake. But if it turns out to be, it's like, wow, I wish I hadn't spent so much time on that topic. Oh, well, let's move on to another good one. we lose nothing.
Yeah.
But if it's what it purports to be, it's another one of those like the resurrection. Well, it would be tied to the resurrection if it's
Sure.
authentic. It would be another one of those. Wow, what a topic! Now, what does that mean for us? So it would be a theoretical topic that has profound implications in our world. To answer the introductory kind of answer, the shroud is a linen cloth, 14 feet 3 inches long by about 3.5 feet wide, 3.7, and it wrapped the body of a dead man. Often the way I do it in lectures, I'll do this. Picture this being a dead body.
Okay, he's
And
holding
I'll
up a
tell you
pen for those that are just listening.
I'll tell you what, it works better with the shorter pen.
Okay.
If the cloth were wrapped around it like this, now the shroud, if the body fell out, the shroud would open up and it would be attached where the head is. It loops.
Mhm.
And the feet would be at both ends of my little pen here. So the head would be down here and the tops of the feet are here. And when you flip the shroud over, you get the front and dorsal image, and the back has the bottoms of the feet. The front has the tops of the feet. So the man's feet actually go over like this because the left foot comes over, not over it, but toward the right foot. And on the back, you would see the same thing, but you'd see the bottom of the feet, and there's dirt and blood on the bottom of the feet. Duh, the man was made to carry and walk, probably almost for sure barefooted. And there's a lot of blood and a lot of dirt. By the way, the dirt on the feet has been measured, investigated, and published in a peer-reviewed chemical journal. And this is one of just many, 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 many dozens of mysteries on the shroud. The quote-unquote dirt on the bottom of the feet minus the blood. The dirt is a species of limestone found almost exclusively in the Jerusalem area. And yet the shroud has not been out of Western Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, so it was discovered in Turin, right? That's a place, or that's a...
Well, it's made
Italy.
its way around Western Europe, France, Switzerland, and Turin is a city in northwestern Italy, basically in the mountains there. So, and it's been in it wasn't shown for many, many years, but now it's it looks like a shadow box, where something can be inside glass. And because of a fire about 20 years ago, it is now in I believe, a waterproof and bulletproof, fireproof, bulletproof case.
Goodness.
So, and it's the image that's there. My little pen fell out of it. The pen, the pen in this would indicate a man lying on his back with his hands crossed in front of him, elbows out on the side. The left knee has popped up. Actually, you could argue that both knees are up a little bit, but the left knee is higher than the right knee, and that's thought to be because of rigor mortis. The leg, the body is flipped back into that form. I said the left foot was a little closer to the right. It's often believed that the left foot crossed the right, and one nail held both. I've got some models over here. I can grab it if you want me to.
No, because most people will actually be listening to this on radio or podcast. So sadly, we'll have to not use visuals, which I know is painful. I saw you use all kinds of visuals when I heard you, and it was helpful.
Yeah. Well, I've got a model of a nail that they used, and it's about, let's say 7 inches long, and it might look like a skinny railroad tie. A nail that's long enough to hold a railroad piece of wood, but not that bulky and heavy as that kind of nail would be, but long enough. So I just said that in case anybody wonders how the left foot could cross the right foot and the nail could go through both of them and still have enough strength to hold the body up on the cross. So, and the person's arms were presumably stretched out because there are blood flows with about a 10 degrees difference that go up the arms on each side. So the blood arms presumably were above the head and the blood is coming down toward the body. So that's a quick little outline. The man is about 5'10", 5'11". He weighs about 170 to 180 pounds. and he's in good physical shape. I mean, good physical shape, like somebody who walks a lot. I don't mean a weightlifter, but he is in good shape.
Yeah.
I do this. I've done this a lot in crowds, hundreds of times, and it's really odd because presumably a husband and wife will be sitting next to each other in the crowd. There's kids around them, and they're all sitting there in church. And when I say 5'10", 5'11", 170, 180 pounds, and pretty well built, you have a certain amount of men in the group who elbow their wife sideways, sort of like a C, like that.
That's
so
cute.
that's kind of cute. That's cute.
Yeah. So this thing was discovered in Europe in what year, roughly, at least, by some nuns or something?
Well, that's going to be debated.
Okay.
The date of the carbon-14 from 1988 takes it to from about 1275 to 1375 in a period right there. And so it's been around. It's been around since the late Middle Ages. Let's put it that way. And there is a trail. There is a shroud trail because there is a trail of artifacts that are copied off the shroud. You can tell there's some really, I'd have to have a shroud image up behind me to make these things really clear. But there are some really strange things on the shroud that wouldn't be in a photograph. If you photographed a person's face, these things wouldn't be there. And yet they are apparently on the face of the man in the shroud because the image on the cloth has these oddities. Like,
yeah, you talked about this in New Orleans when I heard you speak, and you said it's influenced all kinds of art about what Jesus might look like, partly just because of the shroud, the markings on the shroud.
Yeah, and that doesn't prove anything about its truth. It just proves a lot of people thought it was true. But the crazy thing about this is that it does have an evidential fact. The artwork has an evidential factor because you can say, I believe the shroud is that of Jesus, and I'm just mistaken. You can say that. But if it's being painted and otherwise used in art from the 6th century AD on, guess what? It didn't come about in the late Middle Ages like the 1988 carbon-14 said.
Okay, so you're saying the trail of art sort of that we have for the shroud goes back before it was
hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Hundreds of years before the carbon-14. Now, of course, the latest information there is the carbon-14 was rather pretty much exploded about 2 years ago. And that's about 2 years ago, right about this time of year. And interestingly, the Oxford Journal that published the article that went after the carbon-14 was a journal that is associated with one of the people who declared the shroud to be a fake in 1288. So, yeah, so this person, I mean, and you know what, we got to be fair. That doesn't mean the editor or the person in question, that doesn't mean they've changed their view and they now think the shroud is true. It could simply be that they think that this journal article is worth publishing because it makes a good point that ought to be considered, not because the case is over.
Yeah.
It'd be like another star witness being brought into court to change the direction of the questioning without indicating that the person is guilty or innocent.
Well, can we just on the question of carbon dating, can we just give a kind of quick summary of what has taken place? So if memory serves, in 1988 they did a carbon dating and it went back to like the 1200s or something like that, kind of late Middle Ages, right? So people said it's a fake, but then there was this thing, well, but you can see where maybe it's a new piece of cloth that fixed something that got wet or burned in a previous fire. So that's actually what they were dating, or it was people handling it on the edges, and that's what they were dating. And so give a quick summary of kind of how they got the date to the Middle Ages, which led to, and still I think to this day has led to a lot of skepticism about the shroud. And then, kind of update us. I don't actually know what's been said about carbon dating since 88, I guess.
Well, yeah. So there were 3 reputable laboratories in Switzerland, the U.S., and Oxford. And what they did was they took the dates and came to some, I don't want to say they averaged the dates, but the scientists have been now criticized very heavily for what they did with the dates. And it didn't come out clearly until recently with an international kind of Freedom of Information Act, and they made the dates known from the 3 laboratories. It wasn't just 3 dates. There were several dates from 3 laboratories, and the dates were kind of all over the place over a multi-100-year area. And so actually a friend of mine, Tristan Casabianca, he's a European professor, and he got together with, there were 4 people. 2 of them, as I recall, had PhDs in statistics. And then the third one was a Shroud researcher and him. Now, Tristan, he had published an article in a prestigious British journal years ago on what he called the minimal facts of the Shroud argument. Now, Michael Acona and I have published what we call minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And the idea is you can take a handful of facts, in our case, somewhere between 3 and 6, that critics admit without any problem. And there's enough there to say that Jesus was raised from the dead, but the critics admit all these facts. Well, Tristan did that with the Shroud. And he took these key facts from the Shroud and published, what do you think this is? It's looking like Jesus kind of thing. Well, that was a while back. And now he came back and he said, hey, something is fishy on this carbon-14 of 88. Now, you're right, Pastor. There are other critiques besides this one. For example, I think the one you're referring to was 2005. One of the Shroud team members, Ray Rogers, a chemist, the chief chemist, did work, and he said, hey, look, I've got some threads of the Shroud here, and I can tell you about what's going on with the image on the Shroud, what's not going on with the image of the Shroud, and compare this piece of cloth, compare this to this. And he says they react differently. They're not the same thing. And he'll say, look, I'm not arguing with you about whether this is Jesus' burial garment. I'm arguing with you about the chemistry. This chemistry does not equal this chemistry. So something is wrong here. We got to find out why this is different. Okay, that was it was published in a peer-reviewed chemical journal. Thermochemica Acta is the journal. And then, but there's another argument that you mentioned. John Jackson, probably the best-known team member, certainly one of them, he's a theoretical physicist, and he argued that since the Shroud has been in now more than, it's been in a couple of major fires, he says you're not going to be able to date it because the carbon is all screwed up from the fires. Okay, but Tristan's argument was different, and it went like this: you guys have X amount of dates from 3 laboratories in Switzerland, Oxford, and Arizona, but you don't take these dates and average them and say, voila, it's 1288 or it's some date, 13th century. That's not how you do stats.
That's right.
Sorry.
You're good. Now, see, if you were here, we could give you a beer. That's Theology on Tap. But
yes, I wondered if I could see through your glass, so I wondered if it really was beer.
This is just water, but we do fill these with beer at our live events.
See. Okay. Well, in his case, remember, 2 of the 4 authors are PhDs in statistics. And they said, what you have to do with a statistic is X, Y, Z. You don't average dates. And basically what it turns out to is you guys don't have enough dates that are close enough to come up with any kind of a conclusion here. Contrary to popular opinion, it didn't prove the Shroud was true or first century. It just proved they couldn't get the date they were getting. So it annulled their 88 hypothesis, it didn't establish the Shroud. But as a result, the dating of the Shroud is an open question. And back in 88, I was lecturing at Oxford, actually. I was lecturing at Oxford, and I went to class that morning, and the student said, hey, did you hear? The results from the scientific testing came in, and the Shroud's a fake. I thought, what? Because a lot of people thought this. We were getting on a bus that day and going on a tour. And so we went into London, and sure enough, these newspapers were stacked high, and they were selling this hot story that the Shroud was a fake. It was the headline of the paper. But the response everybody had, the scientists, was something like this: We've had a lot of tests. We've done every non-destructive thing you can do to this cloth. And we don't have a test for Jesus, but we do have a test for authenticity of a cloth. And this thing passes. So what throws us for a loop here is that you're going to have this carbon-14, which is going to go against all these other dozens of tests, and we're going to throw it all out. It doesn't nullify these. So it was a big conundrum. So Tristan's, both Ray Rogers' 1905 article, John Jackson's Byrne article, and this one just came out, all are saying, yeah, maybe those other tests are still thoughtful and good and everything else, but we have to move on with the testing. We can't let the carbon dating hold us back. That was the point of what happened with the last test.
Because there are other things about the actual cloth that are important, right? Like the type of linen, the technique used in weaving it, things of that nature. Those are consistent with, say, first century patterns. Not so. Even if we can't get the carbon date, there isn't anything that would obviously pull it out of the first century. I mean, it could be a hoax.
People have made objections and say this is rare. I mean, here's some of the comebacks. There's a little bit of cotton in the fiber, but it's not cotton. But that was cotton. What I understand wasn't grown in Western Europe at that time. Another thing, I gave you the example of the dirt on the feet being a type of limestone from Jerusalem. The problem with this is, how would you get dirt from on the feet from Jerusalem? You go easy. You send a guy there. Whoa! Time out. In the Middle Ages, we don't have tests that can say that dirt is limestone from Jerusalem. So who cares if the dirt is limestone from Jerusalem? You can't tell what it is. Oh, he's got dirt on his feet. Okay, great, wonderful. Yeah,
yeah.
and you can't. There's blood, but you can't do a blood type. Not in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
So they have, but not in the Middle Ages. So there's a lot of things in the shroud. There's an argument about the coins over the eyes, whether they are, as some have argued, a leptons of Pontius Pilate, like the widow's mite kind of thing, a lepton of Pontius Pilate from 29 to 32 AD. How would they know what a lepton of Pontius Pilate was in the Middle Ages? You wouldn't go there and go, oh, well, why don't you just go to Israel and buy one? What are you going to go to the coin shop in Jerusalem? It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things on the shroud. Yeah, the guy has this strange. A lot of things were done to Jesus that were not done to normal crucifixion victims. A lot. I tell people, if your son or daughter is doing a report on crucifixion, don't use Jesus as an example, because a lot of things happened to him that were not normal. Well, bingo, the same thing happened to the guy in the shroud. So then what you could say was, well, there's some poor soul who was crucified to look just like Jesus. They tried to mimic Jesus. Well, that doesn't work either, because the image of Jesus disobeys some of the major medieval beliefs at that time. Best known of all would be the nail where the hand crosses. You can only see the left hand wrist, because the right wrist is covered by the hand. They cross in the middle. And the nail hole is in the wrist. It's the base of the palm and the wrist. And now doctors know that a nail through the palm of a man, the base of the palm would rip out during crucifixion.
Yep.
So the wrist, almost everybody now, medical and theological, we just, three of us just did an article in a medical journal on what is death by crucifixion, what happens when you're crucified. And one of them is that wrist wound is pretty much taken for granted now. But I'm telling you what, it wasn't before the shroud research. It wasn't. In fact, a well-known art historian said that he has not, of the hundreds of pieces of art he's seen from the Middle Ages, he has never seen one where the nail hole is anywhere but in the palm of the hand.
Yeah, interesting.
So if you're going to crucify this poor guy to look like he's faking the shroud picture, whatever you do, don't put the nail in the wrist, stupid. Right. What are you trying to do? People are going to go, yeah, I almost believe this thing, except for the wrist, the holes in the wrist.
Yeah.
You know? And the crown of thorns are like a skull cap. It goes over his entire head. It's not a little thin, little dainty wreathlet that's just crammed down over, like a Olympian's award or something.
Wreath.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are not normal.
Interesting.
So the the shroud, like when people think of the shroud and the image of the shroud, it's actually the negative of the image. Would you just talk about that a little bit? Because we're kind of talking about how it was discovered, but wasn't it when the Italian photographer in the 1890s took a picture, but it was in the I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's
okay.
Fine. Go for it. Go for it.
But I mean, if you just looked at the shroud, it looks like a piece of linen with some dirt on it almost. I mean, you can make out a face or something, but anyway, sorry, I jumped ahead.
Yeah. So when people are looking at the picture that I have up behind me when I'm showing slides, I'll say, yeah, I'm not seeing an image there, at least in the positive. The negative, you can see the image really well. But the guy's name was Secunda Pia, and in 1898, I think, he did one of those things you see in the old Western movies where he took the plates and he had to put the, get the photograph and put like like the Western gunslingers would say smile, and they would take those pictures for the newspaper. That's how the shroud looked. But when he put the plates, when he developed them, something really remarkable happened, because what was looking at him is very different than what he was looking at when he saw the positive. Now, the positive turns out, what you see at the naked eye turns out to be sort of a negative. And what is really there, anybody who takes a picture can see this on their own camera. You have a negative, and the negative has all the really clear marks. Now, I'm not saying that the positive has nothing. The positive has clear marks, but not like the negative does. And there's a left-right, light-darkness reversal in the photograph. So the famous, a number 3 shaped blood stain on the man's forehead. Well, when you look at the two pictures, one of them, the 3 is frontwards, and the other one, the 3 is backwards. Mm-hmm. But those are the elements of, you have both of them. Those are the positive and negative. So there's positive, negative, left, right reversal. And ever since 1898, that's one of the interesting things. It's not one of the toughest things to explain. I had a debate recently on the shroud with a guy, and I made it number 10. The 10 most interesting thing to describe. There's 9 things ahead of it that scientifically are virtually impossible to explain.
Well, care to tell us another one of those? I mean, I have questions to go to, but that sounds intriguing.
Sure, I could tell you a few of them real fast. I used to say when I first started lecturing, my co-author on my 2 shroud books, by the way, was Ken Stevenson. Unfortunately, just got an email from him this morning, told me his mom died. Anybody wants to pray for Ken Stevenson, but Ken was one of the members of the scientific team that did the 1978 investigation, and we co-authored 2 books together. And when we talk about this, back when Ken and I first got together and put the 2 halves of our book together, I just finished my PhD on the resurrection, and Ken said, "Hey, well, I'm one of the shroud guys, and you're one of the resurrection guys. Why don't we put our halves together?" And that's how our book got started. I didn't even know him. The first night he asked me to, let's co-author a book, and I did not know him before that phone call.
Is that what got you interested in the shroud to begin with? Because I was curious how you got into this.
No, I was interested in the shroud, and I called one of the couple biggest named researchers, and they said, "I really can't talk to you about this because we have an agreement not to talk to reporters." And I said, "I'm not a reporter, I have a PhD." And he said, "Well, if you have a PhD, you should be doing this research on your own. Don't be calling me." I mean, he was kind of nice about it, but he said, "I just can't talk to you." And then he said, "I'll tell you what," he said, "we do have a publicity guy, an editor, who you can talk to." That was Ken. And he said, "Let me give you Ken's number." And I called Ken that night. Before the call was over, he said, "Let's do this book together."
Interesting. Okay.
Well, early when I started lecturing with Ken on the shroud, I would say the number 1 most difficult thing to explain was the 3D nature of the image. Now, if you take a photo of the shroud and you put the photo into a computer, like, I don't know how it works scientifically, but when the face of the shroud is interpreted, the machine is called a VP8 image analyzer, and it's used for space photos or distance between Voyager space shots and, like, say, Mars. And it gives distance. It gives distance information. So when they put the face picture in there, it gave distance information. And there are really no 3D photos today. I mean, actual 3D. But an image on the shroud in the VP8 image analyzer you can see they're famous. You can find them anywhere online. They're 3D photos of the face. They're used to make an image of the man's face, the man who was in the shroud. And that's because there's cloth to body distance. You go, that's number one? Well, in those days it was, because what that shows is the man's lying on his back, his left hand crosses his right, his wrist, his angle is right, his left ankle turns toward his right, and so on. But whatever created the image on the shroud jumped across the distance of up to a few centimeters. How do you know that? Because the cloth wasn't touching the body in several places. There's fallout. Like the cloth could be across your forehead, your nose, and your chin. But
Right.
where did the eyes come from? What about the sides of the face? What about the obviously certain parts, high points of the body would be there, and lower points would drop out. So that 3D is very hard to explain. Another one is the shroud is superficial. That means if you take a thread, and a thread might have 200 fibrils in it. I mean, very, very thin to make up the thread. And the image on the shroud is only 1, maybe 2 fibrils deep. So it's 1 to 2/100ths of a thread thick. But anything we know that makes images, paint, dye, powder, dry application, wet application, it soaks, it goes down. There's even fallout from dry applications. So the shroud image should not be superficial unless it's not, created.
Natural.
Third one is the shroud image is non-directional. We have a photo of non-directionality in one of our 2 books, and it looks like you took a lampshade off a lamp, and photographed the bulb. And what it looks like is, boom, just a bunch of light.
This was my favorite thing that you said in the lecture I heard you say. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, directionality would be if you're left-handed like I am. You're coloring and you're going left to right. You get tired. You start going up to down, and that's how we color. That's directionality, and there's no directionality in the shroud. But in recent years, a real hot item is that you can apparently see the teeth through the lower lip. And it's not because his lip was ripped and you're actually seeing his teeth. You're seeing through the beard and through the skin into his mouth. And there appear to be teeth there. And in the backs of the hands, you can see the bones in the hand all the way up toward the wrist. And they even wondered if he had Marfan syndrome for a while, which is like Abraham Lincoln. Tall, thin people who have long, drawn-out bones. And they thought Jesus could have had Marfan's, if it's Jesus at all. Well, they said, no. What you're doing is, thanks for giving evidence. And you go, for what? Well, thanks for giving evidence for the fact that this is radiation from a dead body, because what you're calling Marfan's is not the bones up here where the fingers are. How come you're seeing bones through the back of the hand? They're not exposed for whipping or anything. You're just seeing his skeletal structure in his wrist. And one well-known doctor, he passed away recently, but Alan Wanger, who has a double medical specialty and was a professor at Duke University School of Medicine, Alan had photographs as a doctor. He put a human hand and the shroud hand next to each other, and he put a human skull and the shroud skull next to each other, and they look identical. They look like, well, what he did was he cut the skull in half, the photograph of the skull and the photograph on the shroud, put them together, and it looks like the teeth are one continuous move from the skull right onto the shroud, and the teeth are lined up, so they just go right across, and the hands look like twins. They both have meat on them, they both have bones, but you can see inside in an x-ray. These are x-rays he put up there, not a actual human, a skull, an x-ray. And you can see the bones. That seems to be the one that's dictating a lot of attention now, because it is one of the arguments for saying that the image on the shroud is one or more types of radiation, like an X-ray. There's more than one type of radiation on the cloth. And it seems like the man in the shroud, this part is solid. The man in the shroud is dead. But it looks like the cause of the image is coming out from the body, so that you have a radiation imprint on the cloth as indicated by the teeth and the hands. So I'd say those are the 4 biggies right there.
So that last one that you talked about was so powerful to me when I heard you speak, you did this bit where you kind of started out by saying, on like a scale of 1 to 100%, how sure are you that this is, the real deal? And I think, people would kind of raise their hands like, I'm 65% or I'm 75% sure. And you would even say like, I don't know that I'm even 100% sure, but I'm pretty darn sure.
I'm not 100 because I don't think any scientific thing can be 100%.
Well, there you go.
Science is inductive, and any inductive process can only be known according to probability. And so I'm surprised you didn't say what I usually say. If someone asked me how sure I am, I often say depends on what side of the bed I got on, or if it was a sunny day when I woke up.
Well, I thought I would leave the dad jokes to you. I didn't want to, steal your thunder.
There you go. Well, I say that all the time.
That idea of there being some kind of radioactive light from within out. It's just such a powerful image if you think about resurrection, coming back to life, the light of the world. It's really neat. I loved that. So that definitely took me from sort of 80 to like 96%.
80 to 96.
I don't know. I'm making those numbers up, So then with all of these these seem like really good evidences. There are a lot of people that still think the shroud is bogus. What are the objections? Like, what are the scientific or non-reasons that people have to dismiss it?
Let me give you one scientific, one non-scientific.
Okay.
I think scientifically, it's not impossible that somebody could learn tomorrow how to fake the shroud. Mm-hmm. Now, the shroud is the most studied artifact in human history, religious or secular. More hours are put on the shroud than any other artifact. But someone could still come up with something that tests the same way. Now, right now, you can't get a 3D object that gives evidence of radiation that is superficial with no direction and no paint, dye, powder, or some foreign substance on the cloth that can account for the image. You put those just 5 right there, put those 5 together, and people are going to say, I can do it. Their problem is when they think they can do it, they send it into the scientists, and it takes the scientists a few hours, and they can tell you didn't do it. You didn't get this. It looks like the shroud, but it's not the shroud. But they could potentially come up with something. Another reason I gave a moment ago, nothing in science is known 100%. You just can't. Sure. You can't get 100% from the data. You can't even get it from the resurrection data. Although I personally think that the historical data on the resurrection is stronger than the shroud data. Yeah. I just think the shroud data would be a nice 1-2 punch in totally different research areas if it were there.
Yeah.
But that's one. Here's the non-scientific answer. If you're not religious, or you're an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, or you believe some other religion, you're an ardent believer, but you're not a Christian. If you're one of those options, chances are you will not believe it no matter what. That's another way to say philosophically, our worldviews are more powerful than our perception of data are. We will favor our family, our church, the part of the country, world we come from, nationality. We favor those things, and you could give me a bunch of evidence that I can't explain. And I could just sit there and just kind of go off on all of them and be wrong in my science. And I could say, yeah, who cares? No, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to refute this, but it's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because I don't believe it. Why don't you believe it? Because it's wrong.
Yeah.
That's a circular argument. I don't care. I don't believe it. I'm not a Christian. Okay, you Christians, then they go on to the next step. You Christians, you Christians can be prejudiced. I'm not going to be. Well, as if now you're following this string of bad reasoning. Your reasoning isn't you can fake the shroud or explain it. Your reasoning is I don't want to believe it. So that's the non-scientific reason.
Yeah, fair.
As someone who is a little bit more in the presuppositional camp more than the evidential camp, I think that's very true. Sometimes you have to talk about worldviews first and the sort of philosophies that people sort of hold to before the evidence. But that said, I have always found the shroud interesting. We held a lecture on it a few years ago. Let me just ask some quick snapshot questions. Then I want to get to maybe a Christian objection quickly. But there's the head scarf. The palladium or something. What's it called? The palladium.
Sudarian.
Thank you. I was so wrong, but I have no pride, so I don't care. But
it's in Spain. It's in Spain. Where's the? What if I gave a silly objection? Yeah, that's in Spain. The Shroud's in France. It can't be the same. No, but it is located there. And the blood type is the same.
What blood type was Jesus? I want to see if he's.
I think it's AB negative, but you're going to have to check that in the literature. It's not something I recall because it doesn't have any bearing on the evidence.
Sure.
You're assuming.
By the way, they have a DNA too. They have a DNA test. But what medical doctors say, I've heard medical doctors speak on it at conferences, and they'll say, "I'll tell you what, we've got the DNA, but whatever this DNA is, it's not Jesus's. I don't care who's in the shroud; it's not Jesus's because DNA, they explain, is one of the touchiest chemical things there is. And if the shroud has been held 10,000 times, touched, carried, moved, it's going to have a combined DNA from a zillion people. You know what it isn't is Jesus's DNA. So I have had people tell me this. How do you guys like this comeback? They said, "What if Jesus's blood was universal donor? Wouldn't that be cool?"
Hey.
That's a really interesting comeback, but it's not, from what I understand.
Yeah,
but
funny. It's just for the elect.
Yeah,
joking. Okay, continue. That was just a zinger.
But the head piece is important from what people who've really studied this have told me, because it does have a history. In terms of people sort of know where it's been. It is consistent with the shroud, even though it's not with the shroud. So I didn't know if you just wanted to say a sentence on, for someone who might want to look into this further, and that is kind of one bit of information. I don't know what stock you put in.
Look it up. It's called the Sudarian. It has a lot of supporters. Often people who like the shroud like the Sudarian. I am quite agnostic on the Sudarian. I don't think enough has been. In philosophy, there's a critique that says two things can be very, very similar, but not the same. Two things this would be consistent if it followed from that. That would be consistent if it followed from this. But because it's consistent, does not mean it has a causal connection.
Gotcha.
And it's that causal bridge that I would be looking for. So I'm a little more skeptical of that. Not that there's any problem with the cloth per se.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier, if you wanted to teach people about crucifixion, Jesus is not a good sort of example or exemplar for that. Would an example of that be scourging? Because they didn't normally scourge and crucify people. Is that correct?
Well, no, they actually did almost always scourge crucifixion. They didn't have to, but they frequently scourged. But my question would be, scourging is one thing. Scourging a man this badly is something else. Why are you taking a chance, if you want to see a real kind of a perverted kind of thing, why would you almost kill a guy and deprive yourself of seeing what death by crucifixion is? If that's what you want, if you want to see a man crucified, you're the guy on the old Westerns who they pay $10 to come around and go, string them up, string them up, string them up. There's always that kind of thing. If you're going to crucify them, i.e. string them up, and by the way, the crucifixion is called hanging in the Greek. In the New Testament, it's called hung. If you're going to hang a person, don't take all the fun out of it. Don't kill them now from the whipping. Get it, hurt them a little, but in the New Testament, we understand why that could be. Jesus was struck or beaten by three different groups of people. In Pilate's case, he apparently wanted to convince the people, this poor man's been beaten enough. Why don't you let him go? It's almost like he kept going to hope that'd be the end of it. And of course, that wasn't it. So I think the seriousness of the beating is a good objection. The man in the shroud, he's beaten in virtually every area of his body, minus his face, his forearms, and his feet. Everything else has scourge marks on it. So it's much more serious than it had to be. And then we wonder, why did Jesus die after only 6 hours?
Yeah. Last short, kind of quick yes or no almost question, and then a spiritual question. Do you think there are any tests left to perform? I mean, I'm sure the scientists always want to do more, but at this point, do you think that they could? You mentioned the problems with DNA. So many people have touched it. You mentioned some of the other difficulties of the fire and carbon dating. And do you think there's anything left to do, or do you think at this point the science is pretty well exhausted?
No, I don't think it's exhausted. There's one major test that there's a whole group of scientists that want to do, and they want to test for what's called neutron flux. And there are some evidences. In fact, an article was just published, argued that there's some evidence of neutron flux on the cloth. Now, if there's neutron flux, this was suggested by a guy named Phillips, a physicist at Harvard University a couple decades ago. And Thomas Phillips suggested there may be neutron flux in the cloth. If there's neutron flux, that would, scientists seem to think, and I'm not, so scientists seem to think that it would be an evidence of back to the a radiation burn on the cloth. Neutron flux would be an example. And by the way, neutron flux would cause the shroud to date later than it really is. It would affect the date.
Interesting.
And if you get a test for radiation, you're getting closer and closer to something really, really, really significant.
Last question. I'm thinking about doubting Thomas, poor Thomas, and Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." So to those, I'm certain that there are Christians who, might have something against Roman Catholicism, or they might have something against the nature of evidence, or the way people use the shroud, or the way people think it's a knockdown, drag out, or knockout proof, or something like that. What would you say to people who are sort of hostile to the shroud on this objection that, look, seeing is actually not important, but faith is more important, right? There seems to be a bit of a conflict there. So what would you say to those who would dismiss something like the shroud? Not like with a healthy skepticism, like I think we all would have, but really be hostile towards it because of this idea that actually it's better if you believe things almost
Without
like in
that.
ignorance. Yeah.
There's a couple of verses in the Gospel of John where Jesus said, "If you don't believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my work's sake." And works there, everyone agrees, means miracles. I really do think Jesus preferred people to believe in him for his own authority and for his word's sake. But he says, I'm not going to call them second-class citizens, but it's like Jesus is saying, if you don't believe me for my word's sake, you can always study the data and believe it for the work's sake. I think he's giving you two options, and it's easy in scripture to see how the second one is used. John the Baptist is in prison. He's a doubter. He sends his disciples to Jesus. Are you a Messiah, or should we look for somebody else? That's pretty threatening. Should we look for Buddha or somebody else? And Jesus doesn't answer like, go tell John to jump in the lake. If he doesn't have faith, then he's not good enough to hang around with me. He says, go tell John what you see. The lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised. Blessed is he who's not offended because of me. And by the way, that's when he gave John that great compliment, greatest man ever born of a woman. That's when doubting John got the compliment. So Jesus used evidences, even with the unbelievers. He said, I'll give you no evidence except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. So the resurrection is the sign. For a lot of reasons, the scripture over and over again holds. Paul's major message when he was asked for reasons in the book of Acts was two things, and they're the same number of times if you count them. He spoke most frequently of the fulfilled prophecy. He basically told the Jews, and that's under attack today more, but he told the Jews, hey, the Messiah has already come. Let me prove it to you from the Old Testament. And he always mixed it with resurrection. So evidences are freely used throughout Scripture. But I do think I think faith was what gets you into the kingdom. I think maybe reason gets you to the doorstep and faith gets you in. It's not dissimilar to marriage. When you say I do to a person, you're not saying I do to beautiful, smart, fun to be with. You're not saying I do to characteristics. You're saying that I do to a person who has characteristics. And we can study the characteristics, but faith goes to a person, and I think that's indispensable in the New Testament.
Man, that's really so good. I kind of want to just cap it there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much more that you could say, I'm sure, about the shroud, and then a billion other things that you've taught and written on, but people can go read your books, right? And maybe we'll have you on again. But if people do want to get in touch with you to talk to you, maybe even about their own doubt, where can people find you?
Well, I'll give you a couple of suggestions. Number one, I've got a website that has had millions of viewers, so at least somebody's interested in looking. And it's GaryHabermas.com, straight through, no bells, whistles, caps.
That's nice.
Spaces, GaryHabermas.com. I also have a YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and look it up, and there's over 100, anywhere from a 3-minute lecture to a 1 hour and 40-minute lecture. I've got a wide range on a bunch of topics. There's a bunch on the Shroud in both places.
Yeah.
Now, if someone, my email is on the Liberty website. Someone can find that. But if they write to me and ask about doubts, I will refer them. For a while, I did the doubt cases myself, and I'll tell you what, it will dominate your life if you talk to doubters, and they're the only thing you do. So what I do is I refer them to a PhD student of mine who's been doing this. He's an ex-pastor, not for any reason. He just saw a real need here, and he works on doubt with people full time. And he's been doing this for a few years now, and he told me he just passed the 1,000 doubter mark. 1,000. I don't think that's people. I think that's 1,000 communications. I don't know what the people count is, but it's very, very common. So I'll make a reference for people. I'll send them to him.
Interesting.
And he'll work them through it because he does it full time. So those are 3 options.
Those are really good options. That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He's a really good guy. He used to be an executive pastor of a church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
I was born in Charlotte. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And I mean, every time I hear you talk and every time I hear about the Shroud, I'm more excited about my faith. So I appreciate you being on with us today. And if any of our listeners want information about Theology on Tap or Theology on Air, everything you need to know about us is at HoustonTOT.com. I think by the time this comes out, we'll be past our December event, but we will catch you again in February. And if you want any say on what we talk about at our live events, you have to come to them because that's where we poll people for what the next topic will be. So if you don't like the topics, you have to come to an event and make your voice known. But until we see or hear from you next, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.